For weeks, a specific claim circulated across true crime channels covering the Nolan Wells case, that his friends had taken polygraph tests and passed proof, supposedly, of their innocence. On a recent broadcast of Crime Stories with Nancy Grace, that claim collapsed in real time, on air, corrected not by a skeptic but by the very attorneys representing the young men it was supposed to clear. None of them took a polygraph. What actually happened was something considerably less definitive, and the gap between those two versions tells you almost everything you need to know about how information moves through this case, and how quickly a claim can calcify into accepted fact simply because it sounds impressive and nobody with first-hand knowledge happens to be in the room to correct it. This is Forensic Disconnect, and today we're breaking down a full hour of Crime Stories with Nancy Grace, featuring attorneys Tyler Cox and Edward Paltzik, representing Warren Hudson, Jax Pitalo, and Morgan Seymour, three of Nolan Wells' friends who were with him on Horn Island on July 4th. We're also going to walk through a separate reaction video that analyzed the same broadcast, because it illustrates almost perfectly the exact pattern of evidence inflation we've spent several episodes now trying to identify and correct in this case, an ongoing project we consider just as important as reporting whatever new developments actually emerge. Quick anchor for anyone joining us for the first time. Nolan Xavier Wells was 18 years old, a first-year wide receiver at Southwest Mississippi Community College, close with his mother, Christine Wells Wansley, and his father, Elmore Wansley. On July 4th, he traveled to Horn Island, a remote barrier island roughly 10 miles off the Mississippi coast, with a large group of friends split across multiple boats, part of a broader crowd that numbered in the thousands on the island that particular holiday afternoon, according to multiple witness accounts collected since. According to those friends, Nolan chose to stay behind on the island that afternoon rather than return with the group he'd arrived with on a boat called the Triton, which departed at approximately 4:30 in the afternoon after its bilge pump failed and it began taking on water. His parents have never accepted that account of events without serious reservation, pointing to the fact that Nolan didn't have his phone with him when the boat left. Among several other details they say simply don't add up under closer scrutiny. His body was recovered from the water near the island's northwestern shore 2 days later on July 6th by a National Park Service ranger patrolling the shoreline that morning. The state's official autopsy findings remain sealed pending presentation to a Jackson County grand jury. An independent autopsy commissioned by the family, performed by Dr. Roger Mitchell Jr., a board-certified forensic pathologist and president of the National Medical Association, listed the cause and manner of death as officially undetermined. No charges have been filed in connection with his death, though 3 separate individuals across 3 separate states have been criminally charged for threatening witnesses and officials connected to the investigation, a reminder of how much this case has already touched people well beyond its original central question. Let's start with the polygraph issue, because it's the clearest, most concrete correction to come out of this entire broadcast. Before we do, it's worth naming who's actually speaking across this hour, because it matters for how to weigh what's said. Nancy Grace is a former Fulton County, Georgia prosecutor who has hosted crime-focused television programming for over 2 decades. Her professional instinct throughout the interview, cross-examining witnesses and testing claims against known legal frameworks, comes directly from that background, and it shows in exactly the moments where the interview produces its most useful material. Brandon Tatum is a former police officer turned media personality who has hosted multiple friendly, sympathetic interviews with the 3 friends and their representatives over the course of this case, a venue they've returned to repeatedly rather than a one-time appearance. Tyler Cox and Edward Paltzik are the attorneys actively representing Hudson, Pitalo, and Seymour, meaning every statement either of them makes on air is, by definition, an act of advocacy for their own clients, not neutral testimony. That doesn't make what they say untrue. It means their claims should be weighed the way any interested party's claims would be weighed in any other context, and it means the moments where Nancy Grace, sitting across from them without a stake in the outcome, actually pressed for specifics, are disproportionately valuable compared to the moments where the conversation simply let confident assertions stand unchallenged. It's also worth noting how this particular broadcast fits into a pattern we've now tracked across several episodes. This case has generated an entire ecosystem of recurring venues, friendly podcasts, cable panel shows, YouTube reaction channels, each with its own tendencies and its own default assumptions about which side of the story deserves the benefit of the doubt. A claim that survives an hour of cross-examination from a former prosecutor carries a different evidentiary weight than the same claim delivered uncontested on a friendly podcast, even when the words spoken are identical, simply because one venue tested the claim and the other didn't. Early in the show, Nancy Grace turned to Brandon Tatum, host of The Officer Tatum Show, and asked directly whether the friends had taken polygraph tests. Tatum said that, from his understanding, all but one of the young men had taken what he described as a polygraph, and that they'd all passed the tests in question. He hedged slightly, noting he wasn't present for the tests himself, but the overall impression he left with viewers was clear. These young men submitted to lie detector tests and came out clean on every single one. Moments later, Nancy Grace put the same question directly to the two attorneys actually representing the three friends, Tyler Cox and Edward Paltzik, and got a completely different answer back. Cox stated plainly that his clients had not taken polygraph tests and explained why in terms any defense attorney would recognize. Polygraphs are generally inadmissible in criminal court, and no competent defense lawyer would ever advise a client to take one, regardless of how confident that lawyer is in the client's innocence. Nancy Grace, herself a former prosecutor, immediately corroborated this from her own professional experience, noting she'd personally seen defense attorneys allow clients to take polygraphs only a handful of times across her entire career and only in cases carrying the most severe penalties. So who actually took a test, and what kind? Cox clarified that it was Katie, the young woman Nolan reportedly spent time with on the island, and one other person, not one of the three core friends, who submitted to what he called a voice stress analysis, a different methodology entirely from a polygraph, though one that operates on a broadly similar underlying premise, attempting to detect physiological indicators associated with deception. Cox said both of those individuals passed their respective tests, a detail worth remembering precisely because of how differently it lands once you know exactly who was tested and how. It's worth noting that even calling this a voluntary act of cooperation requires some care. A voice stress test administered to a person's associate, rather than to the person whose actions are actually in question, tells you comparatively little about the three friends' own account of that day, whatever it does or doesn't tell you about Katie's. This matters for a specific practical reason. A polygraph and a voice stress analysis are not interchangeable, and treating them as though they were, whether through simple confusion or something more deliberate, meaningfully changes how confident the public should be in the underlying claim. Polygraphs, whatever their well-documented scientific limitations, are at least the more established and more frequently studied of the two methods, having been the subject of decades of academic research into their accuracy rates, false positive rates, and susceptibility to countermeasures. Voice stress analysis is generally considered even less reliable by forensic psychology researchers, and it's rarely, if ever, treated as dispositive of anything in a serious criminal investigation. Several U.S. courts have specifically excluded voice stress analysis results as evidence, citing an even weaker scientific foundation than polygraphs already have, a legal track record worth remembering before treating a past voice stress test as proof of much of anything. More importantly, the people who actually took any kind of deception detection test in this case are not the three friends whose potential culpability has been the subject of a month of national speculation. They're two separate individuals, one of whom, Katie, has become a secondary figure in this story specifically because of questions about her own account of that day. The claim that the boys passed their polygraphs was, according to their own attorneys speaking on the record, simply untrue on every specific point. Wrong test entirely. Wrong subjects entirely. We want to be fair to Brandon Tatum here, because his error appears to have been one of secondhand information rather than fabrication. He was explicit that he was relaying what he'd been told rather than something he'd personally witnessed. But that's precisely the mechanism by which misinformation compounds in a case like this one. A host repeats something he was told in good faith. Thousands of viewers hear it stated confidently on a program with real reach. The correction, when it comes, arrives later, in a different broadcast, delivered almost as an aside, and inevitably reaches a smaller fraction of the audience that absorbed the original, more dramatic version. We've made a point on this channel of trying to run down claims like this one, specifically because the correction so rarely travels as far as the error. It's worth pausing on why this particular error was so easy to generate and so hard to catch without direct access to the people actually involved. Polygraph has become something close to a shorthand in true crime coverage generally. A word audiences recognize instantly as meaning lie detector test, carrying with it decades of cultural weight from courtroom dramas and true crime documentaries, even though the actual scientific consensus on polygraph reliability remains genuinely contested among researchers. Voice stress analysis doesn't carry that same cultural shorthand. Most viewers have never heard of it, have no intuitive sense of how it works or how reliable it is, and are unlikely to ask follow-up questions about it the way they might about a polygraph. That asymmetry, one term instantly legible and dramatic, the other obscure and technical, creates exactly the right conditions for a claim to drift from "they took a voice stress test" toward the much more familiar and more impressive sounding "they took a polygraph" even without anyone consciously deciding to exaggerate, a kind of linguistic erosion that happens gradually, retelling by retelling, until nobody along the chain can point to the exact moment it changed. Now to the second major thread in this broadcast, and the one we think deserves the most careful unpacking. The mark on the back of Nolan's head, and what's actually been said about it versus what's being claimed about it elsewhere online. Nancy Grace described early in the segment what she called a large mark on Nolan's occipital region, the back of the skull, using language suggesting significant, deep tissue involvement. We went back to the actual source material to check this claim against what Dr. Mitchell's independent autopsy report actually says, and it's worth walking through exactly what he found in his own documented language, because the gap between his finding and how it's being characterized elsewhere is substantial. According to Mitchell's report, presented by Ben Crump at the NAACP National Convention in Chicago on July 22nd, a posterior head and neck dissection revealed a focal area of red discoloration in the deep soft tissue overlying the occipital bone, at the back of the skull. Multiple outlets reporting on the press conference, including PBS, Fox 32 Chicago, and the Mississippi Free Press, described the measurements of this area consistently as roughly 12 by 8 inches, a figure worth noting carefully, since an area that large would cover a substantial portion of the back of the skull and upper neck, considerably more extensive than the phrase "a mark" tends to conjure in most people's minds. Mitchell explicitly stated there were no fractures of the underlying skull and no lacerations of the overlying skin. He reported the cause of the discoloration as unclear, specifically noting that decomposition, which was already advanced by the time he examined the body, can produce exactly this kind of discoloration on its own through a process called lividity, the post-mortem settling of blood with no connection to any injury whatsoever. He said the finding was significant enough to warrant further investigation, not that it confirmed or even strongly suggested blunt force trauma. That's a meaningfully different statement than what circulated in the reaction segment we reviewed alongside this broadcast, which described the mark as indicating blunt force trauma prior to or during Nolan's death, framed as though this were something close to a settled forensic conclusion. It is not. Mitchell's own report, in his own words, says the cause is unclear and explicitly leaves open the possibility that it's a normal artifact of decomposition rather than evidence of any injury at all. This is, frankly, the same pattern we walked through in a previous episode about forensic pathologist Dr. Judy Melineck's commentary on this case, a careful, hedged, genuinely uncertain finding from a credentialed expert flattened somewhere in the retelling into a confident claim the original source never actually made. It happened with "may be consistent with manual strangulation" becoming confirmed strangulation. It's now happening with "cause of discoloration unclear," possibly consistent with decomposition, becoming "indicates blunt force trauma." We'd ask you to hold on to some skepticism the next time you see this specific detail presented anywhere as a smoking gun, because the person who actually examined it never described it that way. It's worth explaining, in a little more plain language detail, why decomposition can produce exactly this kind of visual finding without any injury being involved at all, because it's the specific mechanism Mitchell himself pointed to as a possible explanation. When a body is submerged or exposed to warm, humid conditions for an extended period, blood and other fluids within the tissue begin to break down and settle according to gravity and decomposition processes, a phenomenon forensic pathologists call lividity when it happens in specific, gravity-dependent patterns, and more general discoloration when decomposition itself changes the color of soft tissue throughout the body. The back of the head and neck, given how bodies often come to rest in water, are common locations for exactly this kind of discoloration to appear, entirely independent of anything that happened to the person before death. That doesn't mean the discoloration definitely wasn't caused by an impact. It means a trained forensic pathologist, looking directly at the tissue in question, said he could not tell the difference with the confidence needed to call it one thing or the other, which is a considerably more modest claim than indicates blunt force trauma, and it's the claim that actually exists in the documented record, not the one that's been repeated about it since. From there, the broadcast moved into what we'd consider the single most useful few minutes in the entire hour. Nancy Grace's direct cross-examination of the attorneys regarding the claimed 6 o'clock witnesses. The two unnamed individuals' attorneys say saw Nolan Wells alive on the island roughly 90 minutes after his friend's boat departed. We've covered earlier versions of this claim in prior episodes, but this exchange added real texture to it, precisely because Nancy Grace, a former prosecutor, knew exactly which questions to ask. She asked whether the witnesses knew Nolan well enough to make a positive identification. She asked whether they'd been drinking. She asked how they could be certain of the specific time. She asked whether the two witnesses were friends with each other, whether they'd discussed their recollections together before going to police, and whether they were the same age as the three friends whose account they were supposedly corroborating. Cox and Paltzik's answers, taken together, painted a picture considerably less airtight than their own confident framing suggested. The witnesses are friends with each other. They did discuss the events together before speaking with investigators, and they are not the same age as Hudson, Pitalo, and Seymour, meaning they're a separate social circle, rather than part of the friends' own peer group vouching for one another. Cox was also unable to confirm definitively whether the witnesses had been drinking that day, and could not say with precision how the witnesses arrived at a specific time of 6 o'clock, rather than some looser, rougher estimate. None of this proves the witnesses are wrong. Nancy Grace was explicit about that too, saying she wasn't accusing the attorneys of lying and wasn't assuming they were telling the truth either. She was simply testing the claim the way she said she'd test any eyewitness identification in an actual courtroom, citing the specific framework Mississippi's own annotated code lays out for cross-examining eyewitness testimony. Proximity to the subject, lighting conditions, potential impairment, and the witness's prior familiarity with the person they claim to have identified. Under that framework, two friends who discussed their recollections together before speaking to police, who weren't from the boys' own social circle, and whose certainty about the exact time hasn't been independently pinned down, represent a meaningfully weaker form of corroboration than two witnesses saw him at 6, tends to sound like when it's repeated as a headline. We think that's a fair, useful standard to hold every eyewitness claim in this case, too, including ones that might eventually favor a version of events we're not currently expecting, and it's a standard we intend to keep applying consistently, whichever direction the next piece of testimony happens to point. It's worth explaining why each of those specific factors, jointly discussing an account before speaking to investigators, unfamiliarity with the boys' peer group, uncertainty about exact timing, actually matters to an eyewitness identification's reliability, rather than simply asserting that it does. Memory researchers have long documented what's sometimes called co-witness contamination. When two people who witnessed the same event discuss it together before either one gives a formal statement, their individual recollections tend to converge, even on details neither one originally noticed clearly, simply because conversation naturally smooths out uncertainty into a single shared narrative. That doesn't mean the resulting account is false. It means the second witness's statement can no longer be treated as fully independent corroboration of the first, because by the time both statements were recorded, they'd already influenced each other. A well-established finding replicated across decades of eyewitness memory research, not a novel or speculative concern we're raising for the first time here. Separately, precise time estimates from memory, absent something like a phone timestamp or a photograph, are notoriously unreliable even among honest, well-meaning witnesses, particularly at a loud, chaotic, alcohol-present gathering where nobody is checking a watch every few minutes. None of this means the two witnesses are wrong about what they saw. It means the specific claim, positively identified at 6 p.m., carries less evidentiary weight than its confident public framing implies, and a careful account of this case should reflect that gap honestly rather than either dismissing the claim outright or repeating it as though it were airtight. There's a photograph central to this same exchange worth mentioning specifically, because it illustrates the broader evidentiary problem running through nearly every visual proof that's circulated in this case. Attorneys referenced a photo showing several people walking along the beach, including what they identified as Nolan, as supposed visual corroboration tied to the witness's account. When the photo was pulled up on air, Nancy Grace said plainly that she couldn't make out enough detail to confirm the identification herself, describing the image as too blurry to distinguish faces with any confidence. If a photo can't withstand basic scrutiny about who's actually in it, even when the people presenting it are confident about what it shows, it doesn't function as corroboration in any meaningful sense. It's simply another unverified claim wearing the visual costume of evidence. We've seen this exact pattern before in this case, most notably with the disputed enhanced audio recording we covered in a previous episode, where a piece of media that looks like hard evidence at a glance turns out, under any real scrutiny, to be considerably less conclusive than its presentation suggests. A blurry photo asserted to show Nolan on a beach and a disputed audio clip asserted to contain incriminating dialogue are, structurally, the same kind of problem. Media presented with confidence that outpaces what the media itself can actually support once someone bothers to look closely. The interview also revisited the story of Katie, the young woman Nolan reportedly spent much of July 4th with, and we think the attorney's explanation here deserves a fair hearing rather than the more suspicious framing the separate reaction video gave it. Early reporting on this case described Nolan as having stayed behind with, in the friends' words, a girl they didn't know. Later it became clear the friends had exchanged messages with a young woman named Katie, which some coverage treated as a contradiction, evidence the friends had known more than they initially let on. Cox's explanation, laid out directly in this interview, is that the friends genuinely didn't know Katie prior to that day, that Nolan met her independently on the island, and that it was only later that night, once they'd realized Nolan hadn't returned and started frantically reaching out to anyone who might know something, that they obtained her contact information through mutual connections and messaged her directly to ask if she'd seen him. Under that account, "We don't know her, and we later got her number while searching for our missing friend," aren't actually in tension with each other. They describe two different points in time, before and after they realized something was wrong. We think that's a plausible, coherent explanation, and one that a purely suspicious framing tends to flatten by treating any subsequent contact as proof of an earlier concealed familiarity. It's also worth being honest that plausible and coherent isn't the same as independently verified. Nobody outside the friend group and Katie herself has confirmed the exact sequence of when contact information was actually obtained, and that remains an open question rather than a settled one. Katie's own sister, Gracie McCormick, has separately disputed elements of how this day has been described publicly, adding yet another voice to a story that already has more competing accounts than clean corroboration, each one sincere, each one partial, and none of them, so far, fully reconciled with the others in a way any outside observer can independently confirm. The timeline the attorneys laid out for that night adds detail worth sitting with on its own terms. According to Cox, the friends didn't start actively worrying about Nolan until somewhere between 9 and 11 that evening, several hours after the Triton had departed the island, a gap that would matter considerably less if the group had all been in continuous contact throughout the day. Once they determined nobody had heard from him, they called Christine Wells, staying on the phone with her for roughly 5 to 6 minutes, before one of them called the Coast Guard directly, a call that ultimately lasted 21 minutes in total. We think it's worth engaging with both plausible readings of that gap, rather than assuming the worst or the most innocent explanation by default. On one hand, a group of teenagers spending a long holiday on the water, some of them presumably drinking, might reasonably lose precise track of one friend for several hours in a large, loosely coordinated group, especially if his stated plan was to catch a separate ride home with people they didn't necessarily know well. On the other hand, several hours is a meaningful gap for a close friend group to go without checking in on someone, particularly one of their own, who supposedly stayed behind under circumstances involving an unfamiliar young woman and a somewhat improvised alternate ride home. Both readings are available from the same set of facts, and we don't think the interview settled which one is more accurate. It simply gave us, for the first time with this level of specificity, the actual duration of that gap, and the specific lengths of the two calls that followed once concern set in. It's worth adding some texture to what a 21-minute call to the Coast Guard actually likely involved, because the number itself, stated without context, can read as either reassuringly thorough or suspiciously long, depending on what you're inclined to assume going in. A genuine missing person report to the Coast Guard typically requires walking through a fairly detailed set of information. A physical description, what the person was last wearing, the exact location and approximate time they were last seen, who they were with, what boats were involved, and often a description of water and weather conditions at the time. 21 minutes is not, on its face, an unusually long call for conveying all of that information under the kind of stress a caller would reasonably be under in that moment, particularly if the dispatcher was asking clarifying questions along the way, which is standard practice for exactly this kind of report. We raised this not to settle the question of how the friends behaved that night, but because a specific number, offered without context, tends to get filled in with whatever narrative the listener already favors, and we'd rather supply the missing context than let that happen by default. The same principle we've tried to apply to every isolated statistic and timestamp we've covered across this entire episode. The broadcast also returned to a topic we've covered extensively in a previous episode, whether the Triton has actually been forensically processed by investigators. Cox made a point of emphasizing that his clients offered the boat up to law enforcement from the very beginning, presenting this as evidence of their cooperation and, by implication, their innocence. When Nancy Grace pressed on specifics, whether luminol had been used to detect washed-away blood traces, whether alternative light sources had been applied, whether cadaver or scent dogs had been brought aboard, neither attorney could confirm that any of this had actually happened. Cox's response was that this falls on law enforcement's side of the ledger, not his clients, since neither Hudson, Pitalo, nor Seymour actually owns the boat. That's a fair legal point about whose responsibility it is to request forensic testing. It doesn't change the underlying fact that, as of this broadcast, there's no public confirmation that the boat has undergone the kind of forensic processing that would meaningfully rule anything in or out. Offering access to a vessel is not the same thing as that vessel having actually been tested, and the distance between those two facts is exactly where a case like this one tends to generate the most persistent, unresolved speculation. Paltzik also returned briefly to an argument we've addressed in a previous episode, that Horn Island's open, treeless, crowded geography makes foul play close to physically impossible in broad daylight. In this broadcast, Nancy Grace's response to that argument struck us as the most useful pushback we've heard on it yet, precisely because she agreed with half of it while rejecting the conclusion drawn from it. She agreed the open beach itself isn't a secretive environment, that a crime committed in plain view of thousands of sunbathing holiday visitors would be difficult to conceal. But she pointed specifically to the water itself, the tightly clustered boats, the space between hulls, the area behind a stern where visibility from any single vantage point on the beach would be limited, as a meaningfully different environment than the open sand Paltzik kept describing. Paltzik, notably, agreed with this distinction when she raised it directly, acknowledging that he wasn't claiming nothing could have happened between the boats, only that the beach itself offered no cover. That's a real, substantive narrowing of his own argument, made live on air, and it's the kind of moment that tends to get lost entirely once a broadcast gets reduced to a single, cleaner headline days later, exactly the sort of nuance that dies quietly somewhere between the original interview and whatever three-word summary eventually replaces it online. We also want to spend some time on the second piece of media we reviewed alongside this broadcast, a reaction video explicitly framed as an analysis of the Nancy Grace interview, because it demonstrates almost every technique we've spent this channel's recent episodes trying to name and push back against. The video opens by describing the interview as, in its words, a masterclass in legal defense strategy and deliberate narrative deflection, immediately framing the attorney's participation itself as evidence of manipulation rather than ordinary legal representation. A framing choice that does a lot of persuasive work before a single new fact has even been presented. It goes on to state flatly that Nolan Wells went to the island alive and came back in a body bag, a factually accurate but deliberately visceral framing chosen for its emotional impact rather than its precision, the kind of sentence built to be clipped and replayed rather than to inform. From there, the video systematically takes every hedge, every uncertainty, every "we don't know" from the original interview and reframes it as evidence of guilt. The polygraph correction, which we'd argue is actually a point in the attorney's favor since they corrected a piece of misinformation on air rather than letting it stand, gets reframed as the moment the truth finally came out, as though clarifying which test was taken were itself an admission of wrongdoing. The occipital discoloration, described by the actual pathologist who found it as being of unclear cause, gets flatly stated as indicating blunt force trauma. The explanation about Katie gets described as the timeline of digital communications exposing a very different reality, language that implies deception without actually identifying what, specifically, is false about the attorney's account. Even the offer to have the boat searched, ordinarily the kind of cooperative gesture that would be read as a point toward innocence, gets reframed as a classic defense move, designed to exploit slow police response times, a reading that requires assuming bad faith first and then working backward to fit the facts around it. We're not asking you to trust the attorney's account uncritically either. We've spent a good portion of this episode pointing out exactly where their claims remain unverified. What we are asking is that you notice the difference between testing a claim, which is what Nancy Grace actually did throughout most of this interview, and simply assuming the least favorable interpretation of every single fact, regardless of what that fact actually supports, which is what the reaction video did afterward. Genuine skepticism should be able to move in more than one direction. If a hedge or an admission of uncertainty always gets treated as proof of guilt, no matter which side offers it, that's not skepticism anymore. It's a predetermined conclusion wearing skepticism's clothes. There's a broader lesson here about how a single primary source, one interview, one broadcast, gets processed differently by different downstream creators. And we think it's worth naming explicitly because it applies well beyond just this one case. Nancy Grace's interview and the reaction video that followed it are, in a real sense, working from identical raw material. The same statements, the same admissions, the same hedges, the same unresolved questions. And yet one produced a genuinely useful hour of cross-examination that left viewers with a clearer sense of exactly what remains unverified, while the other produced a video that treated every single uncertain detail as though it pointed in one predetermined direction. The raw material didn't change between those two pieces of content. Only the interpretive lens did. That's worth remembering the next time you watch two different channels cover what looks, on the surface, like the exact same interview or the exact same piece of evidence, and come away with wildly different conclusions. The underlying facts are often less different than the framing applied to them. We also think it's worth acknowledging directly that this dynamic cuts in every direction, including potentially against our own coverage, which is exactly why we try to show you the actual language experts and witnesses use, rather than just our summary of what they supposedly said. If we get something wrong, and cases this fluid make that a real possibility over time, we'd rather you be able to check our account against the primary source directly than simply take our word for it. That's the same standard we're holding Tatum, Cox, Paltzik, Nancy Grace, and the reaction video to throughout this episode, and we don't think it would be fair to exempt ourselves from it, no matter how confident we might sound doing it. There's one more discrepancy worth flagging before we close. A small one, but the kind that matters for anyone trying to track this case's numbers accurately. Nancy Grace referenced a reward of $125,000 for information leading to the truth of what happened to Nolan Wells, tied to a tip line she read on air. In prior reporting we've covered on this channel, the combined reward from contributions by the Reverend Al Sharpton, Tyler Perry, Kerry Washington's husband Nnamdi Asomugha, and a separate $50,000 contribution from Warren Hudson's own father, added up to closer to $175,000. It's possible these are simply two different reward pools, one tied specifically to Nancy Grace's program and tip line, another tied to the broader coalition of public figures who've contributed separately. It's also possible one of these figures is simply outdated. We don't have a clean reconciliation of the two numbers as of this recording, and we'd rather tell you that plainly than pretend we do. If anything, The existence of multiple, seemingly uncoordinated reward pools attached to the same case says something about how many different individuals and organizations feel invested enough in seeing this resolved to put their own money behind it, even if the accounting between them hasn't been cleanly unified anywhere in the public record. So where does this leave the overall picture? A month and change into a case that still has no officially released cause of death, and no shortage of people willing to tell you, with total confidence, exactly what that missing answer must be. The polygraph claim that's been circulating is confirmed false by the very attorneys it was meant to help. The actual tests were voice stress analyses given to different people entirely. The dramatic head injury claim circulating in some corners of this case's coverage overstates what the only pathologist who's actually examined that specific area of Nolan's body was willing to say about it. The 6 o'clock witness claim remains genuinely unresolved, weaker under direct cross-examination than its confident public framing suggests, but not disproven either. The Katie timeline has a coherent, plausible explanation that hasn't been independently verified, and the Triton, despite having been offered up for inspection from the beginning, still has no public record of the kind of forensic testing that would actually tell us something concrete about what happened aboard it. Nolan Wells's cause and manner of death remain officially undetermined, exactly as they've been since the state's own findings were first sealed. The state's autopsy findings remain pending presentation to a Jackson County grand jury. No charges have been filed against anyone in connection with his death. We'll keep tracking each of these individual threads as they develop, the same way we have from the beginning of this case, and we'll keep applying the same standard to every claim we cover, regardless of which side of this story it happens to favor. What's actually been said by the person who actually said it, and how far that is from what other people are now claiming they said, in whichever direction that gap happens to run. We want to close with a word about the format this episode took, because it's a departure from our usual structure, and we think that's worth acknowledging directly rather than pretending it's business as usual. Most of our episodes on this case walk through a single new development. This one walked through a single broadcast, cross-referenced against a second piece of content reacting to it, because we thought the contrast between the two was itself the most instructive thing we could show you right now, more instructive, honestly, than any individual new fact either one contained on its own. A month and a half into this case, we're increasingly convinced that the biggest obstacle to public understanding isn't a shortage of information. It's the sheer volume of that information passing through so many different hands, each one applying its own framing, before it ever reaches a viewer trying to make sense of what actually happened to Nolan Wells on that island. We can't fix that problem for the entire true crime media ecosystem, and we don't pretend our own coverage sits somehow outside of it. What we can do, every time we sit down to make one of these episodes, is show our own work clearly enough that you can check it, and trust you to draw your own conclusions from there. This has been Forensic Disconnect. We unlock the cases that deserve to be remembered.